For 80 years, a fresco of Jesus Christ clung to the walls of a Spanish church, slowly disappearing. Every year, a little more of his face vanished into the plaster, until one woman decided she couldn't watch anymore. What she did next would make her the most famous art restorer in the world for all the wrong reasons. This painting would generate millions of dollars, spark international legal battles, and force us to ask a question that still haunts the art world today. When does destruction become creation? Our story begins not with disaster, but with devotion. Borja, Spain, population 5,000, sits in the Aragon region, a place where history breathes through every stone. The Sanctuary of Mercy, built in the 16th century, perches on a hill overlooking terracotta rooftops and olive groves. Inside this church, morning light filters through narrow windows, illuminating centuries of prayer, and on one wall, modest and easily overlooked, hung a fresco painted in 1930 by Elias Garcia Martinez. Garcia Martinez was a respected professor at the School of Arts and Crafts in Zaragoza. He wasn't a household name like Michelangelo or Caravaggio, but he was accomplished, a trained artist who understood classical technique, who had studied the masters, who knew how to capture human suffering with dignity. His Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, depicted Jesus Christ at perhaps the most vulnerable moment of the Passion, the trial before Pontius Pilate, wearing a crown of thorns wrapped in a purple robe. The face Garcia Martinez painted was traditionally beautiful, sorrowful eyes cast downward, a quiet acceptance of suffering, the kind of sacred image that had been repeated for 2,000 years. And wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to offer comfort to the people of Borja, to give them a focal point for prayer, to connect this small town to a tradition that stretched back centuries. Among those who prayed before it was Cecilia Gimenez. Born in 1931, the year after the fresco was painted, she grew up with this image. As a child, she looked up at Christ's face during Mass. As a young mother, she brought her own children to see it. As a grandmother, she watched it become part of her family's spiritual landscape. Cecilia wasn't just a devoted parishioner. She was an amateur painter herself, self-taught mostly, with some local classes over the years. Nothing professional, nothing formal. She painted flowers, landscapes, simple portraits, the kind of hobby that brings joy. By the early 2000s, she began to notice something heartbreaking. The fresco was dying. Humidity. Borgia's ancient enemy was seeping through the church walls. Every year, more paint flaked away. Christo's face became harder to see, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The church didn't have money for professional restoration. The parish priest, Father Santiago, watched helplessly as the painting deteriorated. It wasn't valuable enough to attract grants or art conservation funding. To the art world, it was just another minor devotional work in a rural church. But to Cecilia, it was everything. This was the face she'd known for 80 years. This was the Christ who had witnessed her entire life. Her joys, her sorrows, her prayers for her husband, her children, her grandchildren. She couldn't let him disappear. In 2012, at the age of 82, Cecilia Gimenez made a decision that would change her life. She approached Father Santiago with a proposal. She wanted to restore the fresco herself. She wouldn't charge anything. She just couldn't bear to watch it fade away. Father Santiago was in an impossible position. He knew professional restoration was beyond their budget. He knew Cecilia meant well. She'd been touching up smaller elements in the church for years with his permission, and the painting was already nearly destroyed. What harm could it do? He gave her his blessing. Cecilia began working in the spring of 2012. She would arrive at the church in the quiet hours when few people were around. She worked slowly, carefully, with the reverence of someone who believed she was performing a sacred duty. But Cecilia had never restored a fresco before. She didn't understand the chemical properties of century-old pigments. She didn't know about the delicate layering technique of fresco work, where paint must be applied to wet plaster in thin, precise layers. She didn't have the professional-grade materials or the training that comes from years of apprenticeship. What she had was devotion and acrylic paint from a hobby shop. She worked on the face first, the part that had deteriorated most. Where Garcia Martinez had used subtle shading and careful proportion, Cecilia applied bold strokes. Where the original had delicate features barely visible through the damage, she painted what she remembered, filtered through 82 years of memory and fading eyesight. The eyes grew larger, more startled. The nose became less defined. The mouth stretched wider. The crown of thorns transformed into something that looked almost fuzzy, organic, alive in an unsettling way. She knew something was wrong. Even as she painted, doubt crept in. This wasn't how she remembered it. The proportions weren't right. But she'd already begun. She couldn't leave it half-finished. And maybe, she thought, once she completed the whole thing, it would come together. She worked through the summer. By early August, she was almost done. Just a few more sessions, and she could complete her labor of love. But she never got the chance. On August 6, 2012, a visitor to the Sanctuary of Mercy walked in for morning prayers. They glanced at the fresco and froze. Where Elias Garcia Martinez's Ecce Homo had been, there now appeared something that defied description. The face looking back at them wasn't Christ, at least not any Christ they recognized. It was wide-eyed, almost cartoonish, with a furry, indistinct quality that made it look more animal than human. They took a photo. They posted it online. Within 6 hours, the image had spread across Spanish social media. Within 12 hours, it jumped to international platforms. Within 24 hours, Ecce Homo was trending on Twitter in 17 countries. The BBC called it the worst art restoration ever. The New York Times ran a story above the fold. CNN showed the before and after comparison on loop. El País, Spain's most prestigious newspaper, devoted their front page to what they called a cultural tragedy. But the internet's response was different. They didn't see tragedy, they saw comedy gold. The memes were instant and relentless. Monkey Christ, Beast Jesus, Potato Jesus. Photoshops placed the figure in the Mona Lisa, in the Sistine Chapel, on Mount Rushmore. Someone created a petition to rename the painting Ecce Homo Erectus. Cecilia Gimenez sat in her living room, watching her face appear on international television. The painting she'd restored out of love was being called an abomination. Art critics were calling for criminal charges. Restoration experts were offering to fix it for free just to make it stop. She hadn't meant to finish without supervision. The priest knew she was working. She'd done it for free, out of devotion, because the painting was already nearly destroyed, and now the entire world was laughing at her. She stopped answering her phone. She couldn't leave her house without cameras following her. An 82-year-old grandmother had become the punchline to a global joke. This should be where the story ends, with humiliation, regret, and a ruined reputation. But in the most unexpected way possible, Cecilia Gimenez's disaster was just beginning to transform into something no one could have predicted. 2 weeks after the photo went viral, something strange happened in Borja. Tourists started appearing. Not the occasional pilgrim or history enthusiast who normally wandered through. Actual tourist buses parking in the plaza, unloading visitors with cameras. They wanted to see the Monkey Christ in person. In September 2012, the Sanctuary of Mercy welcomed over 6,000 visitors. In October, nearly 10,000. By the end of the year, more than 40,000 people had made the pilgrimage to see Cecilia's restoration, a 5,700% increase over the previous year. The church, previously operating on donations, began charging a €1 entrance fee. They had to hire staff, they extended hours, they created a gift shop. But the economic impact spread far beyond the church. Restaurants that had been struggling suddenly had waiting lists. Hotels filled for the first time in decades. Shops that sold religious souvenirs started carrying Monkey Christ merchandise. Mugs, t-shirts, postcards, magnets. The town council realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The disaster everyone predicted would damage Borja's reputation was actually putting them on the map for the first time in centuries. Tourists came from Japan, Australia, the United States, Brazil. They came because they'd seen the memes. They came because they wanted to be part of the joke, but something happened when they arrived. They looked at the painting, and many of them stopped laughing. In person, Cecilia's work had an unexpected power. It was crude, yes, almost childlike in its simplicity, but there was something genuine in those wide, startled eyes, something vulnerable, something that spoke to human imperfection in a way the original, technically perfect fresco never had. "It's strangely moving," one visitor wrote, "more honest than most religious art." Another said, "It looks how faith feels, imperfect but sincere." Art critics began publishing different takes. Was this accidental outsider art? A postmodern commentary on restoration and originality? A folk art masterpiece born from genuine devotion? The narrative was shifting, but with the money came conflict. By September 2012, the church had earned over €50,000 in entrance fees alone. Merchandise sales were climbing, and Cecilia Gimenez, the woman who had created this phenomenon, hadn't received a single euro. She filed a lawsuit. Not out of greed, her lawyer argued, but out of principle. The church was profiting from her work, however unintentional that work's success had been. Under Spanish intellectual property law, didn't she have rights to the image she'd created? The case divided opinion sharply. Some saw an elderly woman being exploited, her work generating millions while she received nothing. Others saw opportunism, trying to profit from a mistake after public humiliation made it valuable. But the legal question was fascinating. If bad art becomes culturally significant, who owns that significance? If a restoration creates more value than the original artwork, does the restorer have rights? Can you copyright an accident? By 2016, the Monkey Christ had generated over €2 million for Borchia's economy. The town that had been slowly dying, young people leaving, businesses closing, a community fading into irrelevance, was now thriving. They opened a cultural center. They hosted art festivals. Other struggling Spanish towns studied Borchia as a model for cultural tourism. The accidental icon had saved them. For Cecilia, the transformation was more personal. The mockery never completely stopped. The internet is forever, but it evolved. She became a folk hero, a symbol of genuine intention triumphing over technical skill. Documentaries interviewed her. Art students cited her work in papers about outsider art and postmodern authenticity. The Sanctuary of Mercy now displays both photographs of Garcia Martinez's original fresco and Cecilia's controversial restoration. They presented not as disaster and correction, but as two different artistic visions, one trained and traditional, one intuitive and accidental. 23 years after Garcia Martinez painted his devotional image, and 12 years after Cecilia transformed it, both versions live on. But only one draws 60,000 visitors a year. Only one has been featured in international museums as part of exhibitions on art restoration, internet culture, and the democratization of creativity. Cecilia Gimenez died in December 2023 at age 93. In her final years, she painted more small works that sold to collectors who wanted an original Cecilia Gimenez. She donated much of her earnings to the church she'd served her entire life. Her funeral was held at the Sanctuary of Mercy, beneath the fresco that made her famous. The church was full. The priest, Father Santiago, now elderly himself, gave the eulogy. He said something that captured the entire strange saga. She didn't restore a painting. She created a mirror that showed us ourselves, our imperfections, our sincerity, our capacity to find meaning in unexpected places. The question that haunted this story from the beginning wasn't really about art restoration. It was about value itself. How do we decide what matters? Who gets to determine whether something is a masterpiece or a mistake? Art history is full of works that were rejected in their time, but celebrated later. The Impressionists were mocked as incompetent. Van Gogh sold one painting in his lifetime. What we call genius is often just consensus forming slowly around what once seemed like failure. But Cecilia's story happened in the internet age, where consensus forms at light speed, where millions of people can simultaneously decide that something terrible is actually wonderful, not despite its flaws, but because of them. The Monkey Christ endures not because it's technically accomplished, it endures because it's honest. Because an 82-year-old woman with failing eyesight and profound devotion created something that accidentally captured what most religious art tries too hard to achieve: a sense of the divine filtered through human limitation. Elias Garcia Martinez painted Christ as tradition demanded. Time erased that vision. And Cecilia Gimenez, trying to save what she loved, created something entirely new: a Christ who looks as surprised by his own existence as we are by ours. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. Sometimes what we break becomes more beautiful than what we tried to preserve. And sometimes the worst restoration in history becomes the most meaningful.